Pathetique Sonata, and it's hard now at the distance of something like 300 years. It was written in 1798, this music. It's hard to imagine just how extraordinarily novel it sounded back at the end of the 18th century. We do know from contemporary accounts by young pianists like Mozart that this was considered wonderfully eccentric music, and he was counselled by his piano teacher not to get hold of the music, but of course he disobeyed the instructions of his teacher, went out and got it and was amazed. So Beethoven absolutely revolutionising the way that you compose for the piano in 1798, and he was only 28 years old himself. We kind of imagine with these extraordinary masterpieces of the piano literature that they were just written in some state of divine inspiration. The reality is that composers and musicians work within our cultural context. Beethoven had been sent to Vienna from Bonn, which is in northwest Germany. He'd travelled all the way down to Vienna, which is in Austria, by Count Waldstein, the establishment, the kind of the musical fraternity in which he was reared as a boy, and very much as a child prodigy. He was sent off to Vienna in order to, as Waldstein said to him in a letter, Count Waldstein wrote to him and said, you are to inherit the spirit of Mozart from the hand of Haydn. Mozart had just died the previous year in 1791. Beethoven had wanted to study with Mozart, but Mozart was dead, so he had to go and study with Haydn instead, which is no bad thing, although they didn't get on very well. But that's the context. Beethoven was trained to consider himself as the inheritor of the mantle, if you like, of Austrian music through Mozart and Haydn. And so the music that he had in his head when he wrote the Pathetique was primarily an extraordinary sonata that Mozart had written only, back in 1784, which is 14 years earlier, the C minor sonata that Mozart had written that year, which had a Fantasia attached to it. So it has a Fantasia, which is this wonderful, slow, dramatic piece. And then once the Fantasia is over, you get the sonata, which begins... And that was the model, this extraordinarily tempestuous and dramatic sonata. And so you've got the very young Beethoven saying, I can do that, and I can push the boat out even further. So instead of the Fantasia, Beethoven writes this much more concise but equally dramatic introduction. And he writes it in a different way from Mozart. He takes as his model for the rhythm and the texture of the introduction a French overture by Bach, the opening movement of the C minor Partita by Bach, which goes like this. You can see those dotted rhythms, da-dan, da-dan, those dramatic Baroque rhythms are what Beethoven is imitating here. It's the same kind of character, but it's very skillfully composed, so it doesn't sound Baroque anymore. It sounds like the new thing, the revolutionary spirit of the age. And this is the genius of Beethoven. He can take quite traditional models and somehow rejuvenate them and inject them with a new kind of heroic character. The introduction itself is in two halves. It begins with the dotted theme that I've been playing, with this very characteristic, thickly voiced chords, very dark, very somber, unique. Beethoven's very good at this kind of thing. A unique sound object, unique, almost like a sculpture. It sort of has a particular somber, heavy quality. That kicks it off with the dotted rhythm I've been talking about. And the end of the first half, is this cadence into the relative major. And it's here that the theme is transformed. Instead of the somber character, now it becomes almost like an operatic aria, as if you've got a soprano singing with an orchestra accompanying it, and then the orchestra bursts in, just like an operatic scena. the soprano. The soprano, and then the orchestra kind of responding in these ferocious interjections. Beethoven loved this kind of dialogue between elements, lyrical, dramatic. And the dotted rhythms that he's inherited from Bach functioning in this very dramatic manner. And right at the end, you have silence. Beethoven brings us to the dominant seventh, the chord 5 of C minor. Total silence. Very dramatic. Immediately, the famous Allegro theme kicks off. Chromatic scale runs down, the cadence into the Allegro, which is in sonata form. And isn't it marvellous? Because he begins with what's called a Mannheim Rocket. He modulates to F minor. It's got a pedal note, a tremolando, but the theme itself modulates to F minor, and then back to C, and then C major, and then F minor. So it's sort of self-modulating theme. Slightly more complex than what Mozart had done 14 years earlier in 1784 when he'd written a simpler Mannheim Rocket. This is not to say that Mozart's sonata is less good. It isn't. It's marvellous. But from that point of view, slightly less complex than what Beethoven is doing at the end of the century, which is this sort of inside modulatory, restless harmonic construction over the C pedal. Let me show you the effect of that. One of the remarkable things about this, apart from the inner modulatory character, is the way the dynamics work. You'd expect the phrase to crescendo to the top and diminuendo. I'll show you. You're expecting this. That's not what Beethoven does. What Beethoven does is this. In other words, piano all the way through the first 4 bars as the tune rises, and as it falls, then you get the crescendo to nothing. You sort of fall off the cliff edge because you go back down to piano. Extraordinary, radical use of dynamics, completely unexpected, completely the opposite of what the 18th century audience would expect. So at the end of this passage, the music tips into the dominant. He establishes a dominant pedal. This is how composers used to set up a sense of key, tonic pedal, dominant pedal. But he does it so amazingly imaginatively. I'll show you how that works. And here's the dominant pedal. Beethoven's so good at this, because every 18th century listener would have said, well, at least I know where I am now, dominant, I know we've gone from 1 to 5. And then he completely confounds that expectation by changing the chord that's over that G from G major to E flat 7, which is going to go to A flat major, and then climbing chromatically, A diminished, to B flat, which is going to be the dominant of E flat minor. That's going to be the key in which he starts the second subject. Very surprisingly again, everyone at the time would have expected the second subject to be in E flat major.
This is blasphemy. This is madness.
But Beethoven doesn't do that. He starts in E flat minor. Mozart, in his sonata, had gone to E flat major. He had a sort of opera duet, soprano, and then the tenor answering, a sort of love duet. aspects of that are imitated by Beethoven. I'll show you what Beethoven does. Male voice, female voice. But do you notice it's much more urgent because it's E flat minor. It's only at that point that we reach E flat major, the relative major. So that's the concluding phrase of the second subject, and it brings the what we call the exposition, first and second subjects leading to this cadence. It brings it to a kind of heroic close in E flat major. So we hear that phrase twice. Beethoven's rather proud of it, so he repeats it. Crossroads, you can go back to the beginning. Often pianists go back to the introduction. We don't really know if Beethoven meant you to do that. I always think it works well to go right back to the introduction. There's no reason why you shouldn't. But you can also go back to the beginning of the Allegro if you prefer. The important thing is we've reached a crossroads. So you either go back to the beginning or you go on into the development section. And this is where things get even more dramatic. G minor is the key, and Beethoven brings back the music of the introduction. Now, here's an extraordinary thing. Change of bass note, and that chord now moves to E minor, of a rather remote key. E minor. Only Beethoven could have done such a thing. You're expecting G minor, a semitone drop, and the whole meaning of the harmony changes to E minor. And the development, the Allegro of the development now kicks off. Is that tune? Da, ba, da, 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 da. That tune is the introduction. Originally an adagio or grave, which is a Baroque tempo indication, meaning slow and solemn. Now it's before this piece had ever mixed together in a development section slow and fast thematic ideas, motivically, in the same tempo. It's kind of radical stuff, this. So the mixing together of the introductory tune and the Allegro tune together, and then the hands swap over. Do you remember at the beginning of the Allegro, you had the main theme in the right hand, left hand was on the tremolando, he swaps them over so that we now have tremolando in the right hand, and the theme, the Allegro, da-da-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba, with offbeat accents in the, very groovy offbeat accents in the left hand. Modulating all the time, that's F major, F minor. that the development section is coming to an end. Beethoven's very good at this kind of thing, establishing a dominant pedal, building up tension, which is going to eventually become a cadence into the recap. Does it so well. Look at this. So you have the dominant pedal, just how to generate tension. If you ever want to compose a piece, always allow time to generate tension, build up some sort of point of interest in order to create suspense. It's like Alfred Hitchcock. You've got your thing, your point of suspense, but to make that really work, bring in some interesting harmony over the top and show the main theme in distress over the top. The main theme is suddenly this slightly agonized thing rising up, an enormous expanded dominant seventh. Very, very high. The registers of Beethoven's piano, the piano of Beethoven's time is not as big as it is now. That's pretty much the full compass of the instrument is being used at this point of ultimate drama in the form. And of course the tumbling figure, Beethoven was a great virtuoso, and that has terrific energy, doesn't it? Dropping like a cascade down the piano into the recap. Recapitulations in the 18th century are often slightly dull affairs where you went through the motions, you recapitulated all the main themes in a kind of form, you know, just a due process.
Getting kind of bored.
That's not how it works in Beethoven. He essentially recomposes the material. So as soon as you get into the recap, we start to go in a new direction. Second subject begins in F minor. In the 18th century, there was an expectation, you get this in Mozart as well as Beethoven and Haydn, that if you've emphasized the dominant in the exposition, in the recap, you emphasize the subdominant. Dominant is 5 notes above the tonic and is on the sharp side. If you emphasize the subdominant, it's a 5th below the tonic and you're emphasizing the flat side of the tonic. So you create a kind of balance. This is very 18th century. It's the language of reason. This is the Enlightenment. You construct this perfectly logical argument with perfect balance between the dominant, the tonic, and the subdominant. It's a kind of axis point between, and they've got the whole of the circle of fifths running from one to the other. So it's like the universe, but held in perfect balance. That's a very 18th century construct, but that's how they thought. And here we are, arriving at the second subject in F minor. And Beethoven spins the second subject in a different way. He goes from the subdominant minor round to the tonic minor. I'll show you how that works. It's the same duet. notice the beautiful exploration of the flat side of the circle of fifths there through that passage? Wonderfully expressive writing. And then the final theme, originally in E flat major and rather kind of radiant, now much more tragic, C minor. Diminished seventh chord, which of course to an 18th century listener represents the ultimate moment of suspense because you don't know what key you're in. The diminished seventh doesn't really have it's just this mysterious harmony.
Oh, mysterious girl.
And out of it, Beethoven brings for the final time the music of the introduction. But this is typical of Beethoven. He removes the chords that precede the dotted phrases, and instead you have silence. So the dotted phrases come out of silence in fragments like this. Diminished seventh, no chord, just silence, and then the dotted theme, and then silence again. Just fragments, as if they're almost sobbing. Those five detached chords that bring it to an end, almost like the 18th century equivalent of the famous ending of Sibelius's Fifth Symphony, with its huge, grand chords just detached from each other. But these are like monuments, like great blocks of stone at the end of the piece. This is extraordinary music for a 28-year-old. I mean, this is absolutely phenomenal composition at the highest level. And of course, Beethoven didn't get any worse. In fact, he got better as he got older. So there's much more to say about Beethoven. But for now, that's the first movement of Beethoven's Pathetique in a kind of nutshell. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks for listening.